Welcome to APPA's weekly webinar series, co-sponsored by the Center for Campus Fire Safety. My name is Billy Zadek, Standards and Codes Administrator for APPA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar recording will be posted to APPA webpage later this afternoon. You will receive a follow-up email in the next couple of days with a link to the webpage where all webinar recordings are housed, as well as a link to our upcoming webinars. We have webinars planned out through December 2020 and are open for registration. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box and they will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time and we still have questions, responses will be sent directly to the person asking the question by our presenter. Professional Continuing Education credits, AIA-CLUs, and ICC recertification credits are being offered. For AIA certificates, please send an email to Billy, B-I-L-L-I-E, @appa.org with your membership number if you have not done so in the past. For ICC CEUs, if you are a CCFS member, please email Kathy Tabor at ctabor, T-A-B-O-R, at campusfiresafety.org for your certificate. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn this over to Kathy Tabor to tell you a little bit about CCFS and to introduce our presenter for today. Kathy, take it away.
Thanks, Billy, and thanks to all of you for joining us today, and a thanks to our presenter, Richard Roberts, who's presenting on behalf of CCFS and our nonprofit partners, APPA and AFAA, the Automatic Fire Alarm Association. About CCFS, we're a national nonprofit member-based organization dedicated to campus fire safety since 1999. We have a 12-person board of directors that are scattered across the United States. The majority of our board consists of fire marshals on a college campus, fire safety educators and inspectors, but there are other members of our board that are international industry leaders. I like to say we're fortunate to have a leadership team made up of known and respected leaders in the area of campus fire safety. Some of our activities include training programs for campus fire and life safety officials and emergency responders, premier events such as our Campus Fire Forum, which unfortunately is canceled this year, but we will resume, or we hope to resume in 2020 with the same celebration of how far we have come since the Seton Hall fire survivors, how far the survivors have come, and how far the codes and standards have progressed since that fatal fire. At this point now, I would like to also introduce Richard Roberts. Richard is the Industry Affairs Manager for Honeywell Fire Safety, and he has over 35 years in the fire alarm and security markets. He's on the board of directors for the center, and he serves as the chair for our Codes and Standards and Technical Research Committee. A veteran of the fire protection industry, Richard is a member of 15 NFPA technical committees and 2 UL standard technical panels. In addition to that, he participates in numerous International Code Council Fire Code Committee working groups, and he's the chair of NEMA, the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rich, and thank you once again.
Okay, thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Billy. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate everyone attending today's presentation. First off, it goes without saying the COVID-19 pandemic has caused incredible stress, pain, and loss. So I hope everyone on the call today is well as your families. I also want to thank you for continuing to enhance public safety by keeping the fire protection systems in colleges and universities operational during this crisis. I know that you have very difficult jobs during normal situations, but this past 6 months is, I'm sure you guys have really had your hands full. So today, the presentation is going to provide an overview of some of the changes to the 2021 model codes, as well as explaining or providing information as to why these new requirements were needed, and most importantly, how they're going to enhance life safety. And the agenda is really straightforward. I'll provide an overview of some of the key changes to the 2021 edition of the International Fire Code, the building code, and then the existing building code. Then we'll switch gears and we'll look at some of the changes to the 2021 edition of NFPA 101 and NFPA 1. Couple housekeeping slides here. I want to point out that, I am on all these NFPA committees and ICC work groups, but the comments and opinions expressed during the presentation are mine only. They do not reflect the official position of the ICC, NFPA, their employees, or any of the technical committees. And I also want to point out that we don't have enough time to cover all the requirements or the changes to these 2021 model codes. Therefore, I highly recommend that you go out and purchase a copy of the ICC or NFPA code when they are published within the next several months. And I'll go one step further. No, I'm not getting any refunds or rebates back from NFPA or ICC, but spend the extra money and get a copy of the NFPA handbook or the ICC commentary. There's a wealth, and I mean a wealth, of additional explanatory information in there about many of the changes that we're going to talk about today, but also many of the requirements. It really is money well spent. And for those who have attended my presentations in the past, you know that I provide a lot of text on each slide, and I do that intentionally, and that's because I want to provide you with a valuable resource document during your daily activities. So all the changes throughout the presentation today will be referenced using legislative text. Red strike through means text is being removed, blue underline means text is being added, and of course simple black text means no change has been made. So now that we're done with all the housekeeping stuff, let's get started by looking at some of the changes to the 2021 edition of the I-codes. And the first code that we're going to look at is the IFC. And the first series of changes within the IFC relate to in-building emergency responder communication enhancement systems. And the reason for this is these systems are one type of a two-way emergency communication system, which is part of a fire alarm system. And second, and really most importantly, these systems are essential for protecting life and property during fire and other emergencies, such as natural disasters or, unfortunately, active shooter incidents. Now, the IFC has required all buildings to have approved radio coverage for emergency responders within buildings since the 2009 edition. Now, approved is a defined term in the IFC, which means acceptable to the fire code official. And the first series of changes add 5 new definitions to the 2021 edition. And these definitions were needed to help clarify the intent of several terms, because these terms are used in the code and some of them aren't, but they're really have a lot of confusion about what they mean. So as you can see, the first definition relates to radio frequency, or RF. And as you can see, it makes it very clear that the term relates to public safety frequency bands as specified by the fire code official. It's not your consumer radio frequency bands that the general public will use for their communications. Now, the definition of critical areas is needed because there is a new provision that we'll review in a couple slides that require the signal strength to be 99% coverage in critical areas. And as you can see, critical areas are exit stairs, exit passageways, elevator lobbies, fire protection equipment rooms, control valve locations, fire command centers, and other areas that are identified or required by the fire code official. Now, a new definition for active RF emitting device is needed because the term is used in the code, and the definition will explain what the term is and really, more importantly, what it's not. Now, even though the term passive RF emitting device is not used in a code, the definition will help explain what an active RF emitting device is, or is not, I should say, excuse me. So a new provision was added to the 2018, not the 2021, but the 2018 IFC that requires a delivered audio quality, typically referred to as a DAQ, of 3.0 for the minimum signal strength into and out of a building. Now, a new definition in the 2021 edition will help explain what that DAQ, or the 3.0 DAQ, is, which is, as you can see on the screen, is where the speech is understandable, but with slight effort, and it may require occasional repetition due to noise or distortion. So this change on the slide accomplishes two things. First, it revises the terminology used to describe these communication enhancement systems so they are consistent with other codes and standards such as UL 2524, NFPA 1221, and NFPA 1. Each one of these codes and standards, they had a different name for these types of communication enhancement systems. So, let's try to make sure that they all call it the same thing. And second, it removes the word radio, and that is to allow other technologies such as cellular to be used for emergency responder communications. And this is important because more public safety agencies are and will be transitioning from land mobile radio to FirstNet broadband network. And of course, FirstNet uses cellular technology. Now, this change will provide assurance to all stakeholders that these in-building communication enhancement systems provide safe and effective performance as required by the IFC, as well as the claims by the manufacturer. Product standards, as we all know, they are the foundation of modern society because they specify the construction, performance, reliability, and the marking requirements for each type of product. And this is especially critical for life safety systems like fire alarm, mass notification, or these in-building emergency responder enhancement systems. So for the 2021 code, equipment that provides in-building emergency responder coverage, they're now required to be listed as complying with UL 2524. Now, the first edition of the product standard was published in October of 2018, and it covers the repeaters, the transmitters, the receivers, the signal boosters, remote enunciators, the power supply, and the battery charging system components. Very much like UL 864 is the product standard for commercial fire alarm control units. Also, the UL 2524 standard was added to the list of reference documents in Chapter 80 of the IFC. Now, looking at 51041, it was revised to require that 99% coverage in critical areas. Now, this change, many people think, oh my God, this is a huge change to the code. Well, really, it's not. It's not adding new or higher requirements. Rather, it's correlating the critical air coverage with the requirements that's in the 2016 and 2019 edition of NFPA 1221. And this change is needed because critical areas, like I said, is really essential for emergency responders to manage all types of emergency situations. So this change to subsection 5 to 510.424 is needed to clarify that active RF emitting devices shall have circuitry built into their design that both detects and controls oscillation. Now this change is needed because oscillation, or when oscillation occurs, it can create significant interference on the public safety radio frequencies, which would render them inoperable. Now, a layman's example of explaining oscillation, and one that obviously I like to use, is when a person is doing a live presentation, all right, or if someone is singing karaoke and they bring the microphone too close to the speaker, the feedback will make that terrible high-pitched screechy noise. So as it relates to in-building communication system, oscillation occurs when an antenna that's located inside the building has too much gain, and it pushes that RF signal back to the donor antenna that's located on the outside of the building. So when this happens, emergency responders are unable to communicate with each other, and it creates that high-pitched screechy noise. So obviously you want to be able to have this detection and monitoring built into the product itself. Now, new subsection 8 was added to this section, and it requires the fire alarm system to monitor and produce an audible signal at a constantly attended on-site location when oscillation occurs. So this change is needed because if you look at exception 1 in the 2018 code, it exempted Class A systems from being designed to minimize the near-far effect. Now, the near-far problem is caused by an improperly designed Class A or Class B system. Now, near-far is caused when a transmission from a portable radio that is really close to an inside antenna or a DAS antenna, distributed antenna system. And when this radio that's very near to the antenna, it will overpower the uplink and amplifier. And when this occurs, the near portable radio uses up all that available gain of the amplifier. So another transmission that is happening at the same time on a different frequency that is further away from the antenna would not be amplified as much. In other words, it's not going to be amplified. So for the 2021 code, the reference to Class A was removed, and that is to require that system designers address the near-far conditions for both Class A and Class B type of systems. Now, continuing with this near-far issue, this change is needed to ensure that both Class A and Class B systems are tested for the near-far effect. As I just mentioned, the near-far problem can be an issue with improperly designed Class A or Class B systems. So, new section 510.5.1. It's intended to maintain the proper alignment of the donor antenna that's located on the outside of the building, regardless if it's permanently affixed to the building or mounted on a movable sled. And this is an important change because the location and direction of the donor antenna is critical to the operation of the public safety communication system. Now, if you mount the donor antenna to the building, it's in a very fixed position, and it will limit the amount of movement of the antenna. However, movable sleds are common practice for mounting various types of antennas on a roof. Now, for the 2021 code, public safety donor antennas are required to be approved by the fire code official, as well as having signage on the movable sled, to say that movement or repositioning of this antenna is prohibited without the prior approval of the fire code official. Now, this signage will hopefully alert people that's working on the roof, such as roofers or HVAC personnel, to the importance of this public safety antenna, and it requires them to notify the fire code official prior to moving it. Okay, now that we're done with all the In building communication changes, let's turn our attention to fire protection, or most notably fire alarm system. And this change adds an exception to 901.7 that permits facilities with an approved notification and impairment management program from immediately notifying the fire code official when the fire protection system is taken out of service. Now, this change is needed because in addition to the normal periodic maintenance and testing, it's commonplace for certain types of occupancies, such as hospitals and, yes, universities, to have just continuous construction that results in the fire code official constantly being notified that the fire protection system is being placed out of service. And obviously, I'm speaking to the choir here. When this occurs, the fire code official needs to determine if a fire watch or building evacuation is required. And in these certain types of occupancies, more often than not, the time frame that these systems are being taken out of service is relatively short. So, as we all know, the basic purpose or intent of a fire alarm system is to alert all occupants in the building in the event of a fire. However, past editions of the IFC and the IEBC, okay, it omitted this requirement, explicit language from Group B occupancies. So for the 2021 code, this section was revised to require the manual fire alarm system in Group B occupancies to activate the occupant notification system. Now, this change provides consistency with other occupancy requirements that are found in the code, and it requires the fire alarm system to activate the occupant notification system for building occupants. Okay, the next series of changes will enhance the waking effectiveness of high-risk segments of the population by requiring a consistent use of the 520 Hertz low-frequency audible fire alarm signal. And that is in new hotels, apartment buildings, dormitories that are required to have a fire alarm system. And this change is necessary because if you look at NFPA 72, yes, it has requirements in there as it relates to this 520 Hertz low frequency signal, but it stipulates both the 520 Hertz signal and the standard 3 kilohertz signal in sleeping rooms of hotels, dormitories, and apartment buildings when smoke alarms, not detectors, but smoke alarms are installed in the sleeping rooms. Now, let me explain. If you look at Chapter 18 of NFPA 72, it requires horn speakers or smoke detectors that have an integral sounder to produce this low-frequency 520 Hertz signal in all sleeping rooms of buildings that have a protected premise fire alarm system. Whereas if you look at Chapter 29 of NFPA 72, it only requires smoke alarms, not smoke detectors, to produce this low frequency signal for people with hearing loss. It doesn't mandate it to be installed. So the different requirements within NFPA 72 present a life safety issue because the waking effectiveness of this 520 Hertz signal is very well documented to be superior to the standard 3 kilohertz audible alarm signal for waking up high-risk segments of the population. Now, what do I mean by high-risk segments of the population? Well, that could be school-age children. I don't want to say elderly, but people that, let's say, when they get into their late 50s and 60s, they start losing that hearing ability in that higher pitch frequency band. Also, people with hearing loss, people who are alcohol impaired, and or people who may be chemically enhanced, all right? So the change here does not require this low frequency technology in buildings without a fire alarm system. And that's because there are no smoke alarms currently available that are capable of producing the low frequency signal. However, it does not prohibit their installation if product does become available in the future. Now, the reason the proposal does require the low frequency signal in sleeping areas of buildings with a fire alarm system is because all manufacturers of system connected smoke detectors offer a version with an integral sounder that produces this low frequency signal. So for the 2021 code, 3 new sections were added. The first section stipulates that the audible fire alarm signal in group R1, R2 sleeping rooms shall be in accordance with 907.52.131 and 132, these 2 sections here. So looking at 907.52.131, it requires the audible alarm signal activated by the fire alarm system to be this low frequency 520 hertz signal. And really, if you stop and think about it, this really isn't a new requirement because, as I mentioned a second ago, Chapter 18 of 72 already requires the low frequency signal in all sleeping rooms since the 2010 edition. However, looking at the new section on the bottom of the screen, it now requires the smoke alarm, okay, to produce this low frequency audible alarm signal in R1, R2 sleeping rooms. But it's only required if the code has a protected premise fire alarm system. Then it goes on to stipulate that where the sleeping room smoke alarm is unable to produce the 520 hertz low frequency signal, then the low frequency signal shall be provided by a listed notification appliance connected to the fire alarm system or a smoke detector with an integral 520 hertz sounder. Now, this change should enhance the safety of people sleeping in R1, R2 occupancies, which include dormitories. So I think this is a very good change going forward for students in colleges and universities. Okay, Kathy, do we have any questions? I'm sure everybody's tired of hearing me pontificate, so we'll give them a break there and hopefully we have some questions to answer.
We do. We have one question so far. Is IFC 907 applicable to existing R1 and R2?
No, if you want to get the existing requirements within the IFC, you have to go to Chapter 11. Okay, and for those jurisdictions that don't adopt Chapter 11 in the IFC for existing buildings, you know, the IEBC, the International Existing Building Code, has requirements in there for buildings undergoing additions, alterations, or change of occupancy.
Okay. All right, and I'll just say to anyone else, if you have any questions, Richard's going to stop again through the to the end of the presentation. And Richard, another question just came in, so why don't I just do that one now?
Great.
Are these requirements retroactive or for new construction or driven by change of occupancy or system upgrades?
Right now, it only applies to new construction because it is in Section 907, which applies to new construction.
Okay.
Good question.
Okay, and it looks like that's it. We'll take more questions at the end.
Okay, great. Yeah, there'll be one more break for a question, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end of the presentation for some more Q&As. And I should say that I also have my contact info on the last slide, so if you forgot to ask me a question, or if it's a month down the road and you have a question, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email, and I'll be more than happy to answer your question. So let's get back to it. And this change was initiated by the ICC Healthcare Ad Hoc Committee. and it permits the elimination of strobe lights in healthcare critical care areas, obviously such as hospital operating rooms. And it goes without saying, a strobe light installed in an operating room could be very distracting for the surgeon or the nursing staff, but it could be life-threatening for the patient. So for the 2021 code, new subsection 5 was added to the list of exceptions. And this subsection 5 is very similar to the subsection 4, except it specifically calls out strobe lights installed in nursing stations and other continuously attended staff locations. Now, basically, this is getting into some of the requirements that get into that NFPA relates to, and that is selective occupant mode notification, especially for hospitals. So this change, I hope, will finally clarify that all dwelling units within apartment buildings or dormitories are not required to be pre-wired for visible notification appliances. And the change is necessary because many system designers and some code authorities thought the term future capability meant that conduit and wiring needed to be run into each dwelling unit or sleeping unit for the possibility of installing strobe lights after the dwelling unit or sleeping unit was retrofitted for hearing impaired occupants. Now, other questions left unresolved for several code cycles has been determining a reasonable excess power capacity for the fire alarm systems, all right, to install these strobe lights, and should a dwelling or sleeping unit smoke alarm be connected to the building fire alarm system. So let's look at the revisions to the 2021 code that, as I said, I hope will finally provide clear and enforceable language for the system designer as well as the code authority. Now, the good news is the code still permits wireless equipment as an acceptable technology. In other words, wireless strobe lights. Now, the first change removes subsection 1, which required the dwelling unit smoke alarm to be required to be connected to the building fire alarm system. Now, this change is needed because NFPA 72 permits but does not mandate dwelling units smoke alarms to be connected to the building fire alarm systems. Now, it looks like item 2 and item 3 have been deleted, but actually they were carried over into a new section, and that new section is 907.52331. So if you look at new subsection 2, that's one of them that was carried over, and it allows connecting strobe lights to the existing dwelling unit smoke alarm. Several important new requirements will provide the fire alarm industry with a standardized basis for designing excess power capacity into the fire alarm system. Now, the system is now required to have a minimum of 5% excess capacity, and that is to accommodate the possibility of installing strobe lights after the dwelling unit or sleeping unit was retrofitted for hearing impaired occupants. Also, the circuits are only, and I emphasize only, required to be run to a single access point on every story, and they are not required to be extended beyond that single access point. And lastly, shop drawings are required to be included, or the shop drawings are required to include the power supply and the circuit documentation to accommodate for the future addition of visible notification appliances. So kind of summarize here that you can use wireless strobes to provide visible notification for hearing impaired occupants, or if you want to use hardwired or wired strobe lights, there's new requirements that relate to that, and how far you have to run conduit and wiring, and how much extra power capacity that you have to build into the fire alarm system. Now, this is a small but important change, and it aligns the sound pressure levels for audible notification appliances in the IFC with NFPA 72. And it replaces the maximum ambient sound pressure level of 95 dB to 105 dB. So that does align with NFPA 72. This change is sort of along the same lines as the one we just discussed, and it will eliminate the conflict between the IFC and NFPA 72 as it relates to emergency power for in-building fire alarm, emergency voice alarm communication systems, or EVAC systems. Now, in the past, the code only referenced this 24-hour standby requirement. It didn't contain the NFPA 72 requirement for the secondary power to operate the system in alarm for 15 minutes at the maximum load. Obviously, that's very important. So deleting the time and simply referencing back to NFPA 72 ensures consistency between the two documents. So let's review several changes relating to the monitoring of fire alarm systems. And the primary technology used since the late 1980s to transmit alarm trouble supervisory signals from the protected premise to the supervising station used copper telephone lines, with the power originating at the telephone company. Now, this technology is really dead. Okay, it's a thing of the past, because since 2015, approximately 70,000 plain old telephone copper lines are canceled by consumers every month. And what are they doing? They're using their iPhones or smartphones. So for the 2021 code, the reference to an automatic dialer was replaced with a pointer back to NFPA 72, because 72 provides the performance requirements for other types of transmission technologies, such as cellular, internet protocol, and radio. Now, I don't know if this is going to be that applicable to this group on the audience today, but I thought it would be worth mentioning, and that is do-it-yourself, DIY, or monitor it yourself, MIY. Offerings are really becoming very popular in recent years, and it's expected that this strong growth will continue. Now, looking at the monitoring it yourself, MIY technology, it allows the protected premise fire alarm system to bypass the supervising station and directly contact the emergency communication center, or 911, without human interface, which has the potential of increasing unwanted alarm dispatches. So if you look at new section 907662, it only allows this direct transmission of alarm signals that's associated with MIY only where approved by the fire code official. And I would imagine that most universities have their own proprietary monitoring station. So don't know if this really applies, but I thought it would be worth mentioning. So now let's turn our attention to the existing building code, which covers the requirements for existing buildings undergoing alterations, additions, or change of occupancy. Now, the first IEBC change that we're going to look at requires in-building emergency responder communication enhancement systems in existing buildings that fail to meet the communication threshold specified in NFPA 1221 or the HJ. Now, new section 102.2 stipulates where work is regulated by the existing building code. It's also regulated by the requirements for existing buildings in Chapter 11 of the IFC. Such work shall comply with both codes. Now, I should mention that if you look at section 1103.2 of the IFC, it requires in-building communication enhancement systems for existing buildings without approved coverage. So this section here, this new section, it doesn't specifically call out in-building emergency communication enhancement systems, but it really ties the existing building code back to the fire code. And within Chapter 11 of the fire code, there are specific requirements in there relating to these types of systems, which will ensure that emergency responders will have effective communications within buildings. So new CO requirements were added to the 2018, not to 2021, but to 2018 edition of the existing building code for certain Group I and R occupancies. But for the 2021 code, Group E occupancies, education, were added to the list of existing buildings that are now required to have CO detection. So this really should provide consistency between the IEBC and the IFC. Okay, Kathy, do we have any questions? Kathy?
I'm sorry, Rich. I had a little bit of a problem with my mouse. Yes, we have one more question. Does 1103.2 require all existing buildings to be tested for adequate coverage?
I'm pausing here for a minute, and it ties it back to 510 of the IFC for new construction, and in there it does require it, but it also has a provision in there that really leaves it up to the fire code official to determine if it needs to be tested or if an in-building communication, in-building communications is needed in a building. So for example, you know, if you had a small 3,000, 5,000 foot square foot building, okay, it may not have approved or full radio coverage in there, but since it's such a small building, you may not need it. So it really provides a lot of latitude to the fire code official.
Okay, and I have one more, Richard. Are there any updates related to MEC or mass notification?
There are new requirements that were put into the 2018 edition of the IFC and the IBC and NFPA codes that relate to conducting a mass notification risk analysis. And I do have a webinar presentation about that. So if this would be of interest to Center for Campus Fire Safety and APA members, I would be more than happy to go over what the kind of the history of emergency communication, mass notification systems, how these requirements got into NFPA 72 and the new requirements in the IFC, the IBC, NFPA 1, and NFPA 101.
Yeah, maybe we'll get together after the webinar and we can discuss that.
Yeah, I mean, send Kathy and Billy an email if this is something that you would like to have. Then we'll get it scheduled.
Great. And Richard, we got a few more questions that came in, so let me go to the next one, and then maybe at some point tell me when you want to go back to your presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate more on the elimination of POTS lines, self-monitoring, etc., specifically for elevators?
Yeah, I mean the POTS lines, a plain old telephone system. That's where you had a copper line going from your house or business back to the central office of the phone company, and then it would go to the supervising station. Well, the carriers, AT&T, they're no longer supporting those copper lines. Everything is transitioned over to cellular, fiber optic, or radio, okay? And So, the technology used in the past for these for sending alarm trouble supervisory signals from the protected premise back to the fire department was digital alarm communicators. And because there are really, the copper lines are not being supported, even though you think you have maybe inside the building there's copper lines, but once it goes outside of the building, it probably goes to one of those little boxes, and it's either going fiber optic or it's going cellular. So you have to transition to newer technologies to transmit those signals from the fire alarm system back to the fire department, and that is radio, internet protocol, okay, or cellular. So it's that's kind of the history of it. I mean, most of the younger generation, I mean, their whole world evolves around their smartphones. They don't have a old type of phone. Yeah, you're laughing at me, us old people, they don't have those phones in the house. It's stuck in the iPhones are stuck in their pocket all the time. So I hope that answered the question.
Okay, I've got another one. The IEBC section 101.2.1 is really scope and administration. Does the work area or prescriptive path through the IEBC have any bearing on this requirement?
Ooh, good question, and I will be perfectly honest. That's a little bit above beyond my understanding of the IEBC. I know that there are work area requirements. I know that there are prescriptive requirements and performance requirements, but my understanding was that, the requirement in 102, if there's requirements in the IFC for existing buildings, it should apply to the IEBC. But like I said, that was a great question, and somebody really knows their code obviously better than me, but it's a little beyond what I'm comfortable answering. So,
okay, and this next one, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, let's take one more, and because I don't want to run too much over an hour, and we're being respectful of everyone's time. So let's have one more and then see how we do.
All right, and I'm not sure this is a question, maybe more of a comment. A complaint by an emergency response agency may drive a survey for poor communications.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's new and existing buildings. So, as I said, a lot of latitude is given to the fire code official on whether to require a survey to see if it's needed or to install or not. So, all right. So let's transition now and look at some of the changes to the 2021 edition of NFPA 1 and 101. And even though these NFPA codes are not as widely adopted in the U.S. as the I codes, a few states do adopt them, and they're frequently adopted outside of the U.S. For example, Florida uses NFPA 101 and NFPA 1 as the basis for their fire prevention code, and Massachusetts, they have adopted NFPA 1 for their fire code. So this change will enhance the occupant safety in large board and care facilities by providing notification to a responsible party of a malfunctioning fuel burning appliance that is installed inside a building, but it's located in an area of the building that's remote from a dwelling unit or sleeping unit. Of course, a NFPA defines a board and care facility. Really, a more common term would be assisted living facility. And as you can see, the term replaces, the change replaces the term CO alarms with CO detection, and that is to correlate with the change that was made to the 2018 code for hotels, dormitories, and apartment buildings. And that is to limit the installation of an alarm to locations within their listing. So in the 2021 code, CO alarms are only allowed to be installed inside a dwelling unit or sleeping unit. However, only CO detectors are permitted to be installed in these remote locations, such as a boiler or furnace room that may be located in the basement. So looking at just like the requirements in the IFC IBC, there are new NFPA requirements that will enhance the waking effectiveness of high-risk segments of the population by requiring a consistent use of the 520 hertz signal in new hotels, apartment buildings, and dormitories. So if you look at section 96210.3.1, it requires the smoke alarm audible signal in sleeping rooms to produce the low frequency signal where required by chapters 11 through 43. Now, chapters 11 through 43, those are your occupancy chapters. So if you don't have anything in the occupancy chapter, all right, then any requirement in chapter 9 of 101 really doesn't mean much. So, and then of course, new section 9633 requires the audible alarm signal activated by the fire alarm system to be the low frequency signal where required by chapters 11 through 43. So let's take a look at several requirements in the occupancy chapters. And these two sections relate to new hotels and dormitories, all right? And where a hotel or dormitory is required by NFPA 101 to have a fire alarm system, it requires the audible notification signal provided in the sleeping room, the guest room, or the guest suites to be activated by the fire alarm system to be the low frequency signal. Of course, it ties it back to chapter 9. Now looking at 283461, the one on the bottom here, it requires the audible notification signal provided in sleeping rooms, guest rooms, or guest suites that is activated by the fire alarm or the smoke alarm to be the low frequency signal. Now, as it relates to new apartment buildings, you know, this change here on the screen is essentially the same as the one that we just covered for chapter 28, which was hotels and dormitories. So just to conserve a little bit of time here, we'll just kind of skip through that. But just remember, there are new low frequency requirements in chapter 28, which relate to new hotels and dormitories, as well as chapter 30, which apply to new apartment buildings. So now let's turn our attention to NFPA 1. And the new requirements in this code relating to emergency responder communication enhancement systems are similar to the changes in the 2021 edition of the IFC. Now, the goal is to have consistency between the IFC, NFPA 1, and yes, NFPA 1225. And the first change accomplishes two things. First, it removes the word radio, and of course that is to allow other technologies such as cellular to provide the in-building communications. And as I said, this is important because FirstNet will utilize cellular technology instead of land mobile radio. And second, it adds the term in-building. And this is to stress that the requirements for these communication systems are for the within the building. Now, section 1110.1 authorizes the AHJ to establish and issue permits, and 1110.1.2 requires a renewable permit in accordance with chapter 9 of NFPA 1221 to be issued after the initial acceptance test. And of course, a renewable permit is commonly referred to as an annual or an operational permit. So this is in addition to the initial acceptance testing. Now looking at the new section at the top of the slide here, it requires these communication systems to comply with the design and installation, testing, and inspection requirements in NFPA 1221. The next section, 1110.3.1, requires the communication enhancement system to be listed in accordance with UL 2524. And of course, this will provide assurance to all stakeholders, the AHJ, the building owner, that this equipment provides safe and effective performance as required by the code, as well as claims by the manufacturer. And the new section, 1110.3.2, is intended to ensure that the system installer is aware of the requirements in the FCC, and that's the Federal Communications Commission, relating to the use of emergency responder radio frequencies. And there are specific requirements in the FCC that relates to these systems. So you really got to be aware of that too. 1110.4 requires the public safety communication system to have lightning protection that complies with NFPA 780. The next section, 1110.5, is requiring that all the repeaters, transmitters, the signal booster components be installed in a NEMA 4 or 4X type of an enclosure. Of course, that is a very sealed enclosure. There's no venting there. As it relates to battery, obviously you want an enclosure that has some protection, but you also got to have that enclosure being able to breathe, because batteries do give off gases. So this requires that the battery or the battery charging system be installed in a 3R type of an enclosure. And lastly, oscillation. We've talked about that several times already. This section requires that oscillation be built into the in-building communication system. This section here requires a minimum neg 95 dBm throughout the coverage area, and that is needed to deliver that DAQ, delivered audio quality of 3.0. And it's really important to require a neg 95 dB, because a DAQ can't be used for designing the system. So looking at new section 1110.8.1, it's intended to maintain the proper alignment of the donor antenna that's mounted on the outside of the building, regardless if they are permanently affixed to the building or mounted on a movable sled. And as I said previously, this is an important change because the location and direction of the donor antenna is critical to the operation of the public safety communication systems inside the building. Looking at the new section at the top of the page here, it requires the antenna installation to be in accordance with the applicable requirements of the building code for weather protection or of the building envelope. Obviously, you don't want to mount that donor antenna in a fixed position on the building and it has a situation where it's creating leaks inside the building. New section 1110.9.1 requires the communication enhancement system to be engineered to minimize that near-far effect. And if you want to know more about that near-far effect, you can go back to the beginning of this presentation. I provide a fairly detailed explanation of what that is. And the last section at the bottom of the page here requires the building owner to have the communication enhancement system tested after completion of the initial installation, and to verify that each floor of the building has coverage in accordance with NFPA 1225. This section here, a lot of text on the page, but it outlines the test procedures that needs to be conducted. So as you can see in subsection 1, each floor of the building is required to be divided into 20 equal test grids. Number 2, the test shall be conducted using a calibrated portable radio that is used by the agency. Number 3, failure of one or more test areas shall result in the failure of the test. And the test, number 4, shall be performed in the center of each test area. Okay, so that kind of gives you some more direction there. And then, of course, here are some more requirements specific to the initial test. So in the event of time here, I think that people can go and review this on their own. And that sort of brings us to the end of the presentation. Do we have time for another couple questions
it looks
here?
like we have about a minute left, and we've got 3 questions, so let me read them as quickly as I can.
Okay.
This is in regards to dormitories. Have there been any changes with respect to two-way voice communication between areas of refuge on each floor to the fire command center?
I know that there are new requirements going into the next edition of NFPA 72, which will be the 2022 edition. I'm not aware of any changes to these area of refuge systems in the 2021 model codes, but you know, I'm writing down here. That's something I can research and maybe get back to Billy and Kathy that you know, they can get out to the group. But I guess short answer, as it stands right now, no, nothing.
Okay. And this is kind of an FYI for everyone. Someone commented, not only are the copper lines being not supported, the telecommunications companies are physically removing the copper once you disconnect your landlines.
Yep, very good comment. Very accurate, yes.
Okay. We'll try. We have quite a few. A lot of comments with a good job, and thank you. One last question, and I guess the rest we'll have to just answer. Richard will answer them directly. Why do you need a donor antenna? In New York City, the system only works within the building and does not go out to the overall radio system.
Yeah, New York City has very unique, different requirements for emergency responder communications. Basically, it's up to the fire department to go in and turn that in-building system on. So, you know, it's not on or active all the time like in other areas of the country. It's called an ARCS system. So, you know, it's New York City is different than the rest of the country. So anyhow, I really appreciate everything. Yes, Kathy will capture the questions. I'll answer them over the next week or so. Get them back to Kathy and Billy so they can get them out to the group. Also, please provide feedback to Billy and to Kathy. If you like the content, let them know. If you didn't particularly care for it, let them know. Also, me as a presenter, if you like me as a presenter, please let them know. But also, if you didn't, let them know. You know, it's both APA, AFA, and the Center for Campus Fire Safety. They want to provide you with good quality content that meets your needs and expectations.
Well, and thank you, Richard, and you did a great job, and you did get quite a few comments from people that said, great job, thank you. For those of you that wondered about the presentation, yes, we're recording it, and yes, you'll have a PDF of Richard's presentation. It should be available on both our websites, APA's and CCFS, in the next couple of days. And thanks, everybody, for your time, and Richard, thank you, and thanks, Billy.
Yes, everyone, please be safe and keep up the excellent work that you do.
Take care,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.